Thank you very much for having me here. It's been really exciting to be at this conference and hear so many really fascinating talks that have covered phenomena that I have not even heard about before. So it's been a really exciting opportunity for me and a great chance to meet lots of UCL colleagues that I don't normally see at UCL. I had somewhat an exciting discovery as I arrived here today, and I looked at the broker and I thought, oh, this is not the title of the talk that I was preparing. And clearly, I think Camilla and I had talked about a particular title, which I then changed months back. I went online, and the online version had the old title. So I thought, well, this is odd that I've agreed to give this book, but never mind, I have to update the slides. And I did a lot of work, and I did that, and I came here, and I thought, oh, I am giving the talk I normally give rather than the one that I thought I had funnily agreed to give. So I then had a furious time updating some slides, and hopefully this is all okay. So I'm going to talk about development of psychopathology and particularly try and do a bit of a thought exercise to consider how we can bring neurocognitive research and genetically informed research to help us think about environmental risk. And that's something that I'm getting increasingly interested about as I'm trying to understand the complex phenomena of how antisocial behavior develops in children, but I think that the sort of the principles that I talk about would apply to a number of other phenomena as well. So essentially, during this talk, I'm hoping to illustrate how we can use multiple methodologies to gain a better understanding of why psychopathology develops. So I'm hoping to show you some data on all these different levels of analysis. Where we are really lacking at the moment is trying to understand the interplay between these different levels of analysis across development, but that is clearly a direction that we need to move towards if we try to understand how mental health problems develop. I'm going to use antisocial behavior as an example because that's what I know about, but as I said, this is an approach that I think could be fruitful for understanding many other conditions as well. Early onset antisocial behavior is something that tends to catch the attention of politicians because it's something that is very costly. People who start antisocial behavior early on cost the society in England about £60 billion a year. It's one of the most common reasons for referral for services. Doesn't mean that the children get the services, but it's something that really understandably causes concern. And not only is it costly to society in terms of the fact that these people are less likely to finish education and be taxpayers, they're more likely to end up in a prison system, more likely to end up using mental health and physical health services, but there is also a social and emotional cost. Being around someone who's aggressive or antisocial or unpredictable is clearly extremely stressful, and understandably these people have difficulties in their social relationships, much to the detriment of the people around them, but also to detriment of those people themselves. And this is clearly why we are so interested in trying to understand and prevent development of antisocial behavior. Now, as is the rule for any condition that we're interested in, we are not studying a homogeneous group of people. We diagnose based on behavioral criteria, then we try and find some underlying causes, and unsurprisingly, it's very difficult to find them because we are not really studying a single group of people in terms of their etiology. So not all children have identical presentation or identical risk factors for their antisocial behavior. So there's been a strong interest in trying to figure out how we can do a bit more fine-grained study of the children with early onset antisocial behavior, or conduct problems as they're called in children. One of the ways in people subgroup children with antisocial behavior is by charting so-called callous unemotional traits. And these are traits that are thought to index risk for severe and persistent antisocial behavior, and in some cases, adult psychopathy. So they are traits such as diminished capacity for empathy, reduced remorse after you've done something that hurts other people, reduced guilt, increased manipulation of other people, and also increased self-interest and self-focus. So you're very interested in looking after number one, and other people's interests are a little bit less prominent concern for you. And we can study children with conduct problems, grouping them into those who have lower levels of callous and emotional traits or higher levels of callous and emotional traits. Typically in research studies, what people do is that they take children who fulfill research diagnostic criteria for conduct problems, and then they measure callous and emotional traits with a questionnaire that has 24 items, so it's quite sensitive for mapping out individual differences. And we and others have typically taken a median split within that group of children with conduct problems to separate them into two groups. And the reason we've done this median split approach as opposed to studying these traits continuously is that there is an asymmetric relationship between conduct problems and callous and emotional traits. So there's no bivariate normality. If you have high levels of CU traits, you almost always have high levels of conduct problems, but not the other way around. And there are all sorts of funny suppressor effects in relation to affect processing between CU traits and conduct problems. And therefore, doing this sort of grouping for high and low seems to be a sensible approach. Of course, you could also cut the middle away and just focus on the extremes, but doing the median split is helpful in that you still have an option of looking at the data continuously if you'd like. So if we look at the level of behavior, what is common to almost all children in conduct problems is that they engage in some form of aggression, even violence, sometimes stealing, and truanting is very common among these children. So there are symptoms that characterize a wide variety of children with conduct problems. But there are also markers at the behavioral level that differentiate the high and low CU, which makes sense because otherwise you couldn't have a screening criteria that separates these groups sensibly. So those with high levels of CU are characterized by their capacity for proactive or planned aggressive acts. So they often commit aggressive acts to get something that they want. It might be dominance in a peer group, it may be procuring something like goods for another child's lunch money, something that they want. And they can do this in a cold and calculated and planned manner. They're capable of manipulating other people, so they are often ringleaders who get other children to do their bidding. And they have this marked reduced motivation for prosocial behavior. So my former PhD student, Lucy Folks, did some very nice work asking these children what motivates them, and she developed a questionnaire to address different kinds of things that people find socially rewarding. And what was particularly noticeable about these children is that they reported significantly reduced enjoyment of pro-social actions. So they didn't really seem to enjoy doing nice things for other people, whereas typically developing children quite like pleasing other people and doing nice things for others. Those who have conduct problems and lower levels of callous and emotional traits often have clear triggers for their aggression. So there's a clear environmental threat, for instance, that these children react to. They think someone's about to hit them, they're going to lash out first. But they have the capacity to feel bad about hurting other people. So these are the kinds of children for whom restorative justice approaches work very well, because they're capable of feeling remorse, and you can really, really capitalize on the fact that they want to make amends. Now, if we look at the cognitive and emotional factors that characterize children with conduct problems, what's common across the group of children with conduct problems, both those with high and low levels of callous and emotional traits, is that they have difficulties in reinforcement learning. So if you use standard conditioning type tasks, these children have difficulty in forming the association between an action that they have chosen and the outcome that happens, particularly if that outcome is negative. So their prediction error signaling is off, and you can see why that might lead to poor decision-making and impulsive behavior. So you do something, but you can't quite yoke the consequence to the action that you did. Therefore, you're more likely to keep on making poor choices. But again, in the cognitive and emotional levels, there are also differences between these two subgroups. So those with high callous and emotional traits have difficulty in recognizing fear in others. So this is work that we've done, led by my former student Alice Jones, but also has been done by other people like James Blair. They also are not distracted by fearful faces. So this work was led by my student Sarah Hodsall, she had a very nice attentional capture task where people had to look at faces of males and females and decide whether they are tilted to right or left. So the emotion that was appearing in the target or distractor faces was completely peripheral to the task demands. So it looked at how automatically you were distracted by the emotion. And the children with high CU traits actually did better than control children or other children with conduct problems because the emotions just didn't slow them down. Psychophysiological data exists from James's group and others showing that these children have lower physiological arousal to distress signals, so they don't get the same skin conductance response to other people's distress. So in a way, we see a picture where signals that normally curb acts of proactive aggression are muted in these children. So typically, we don't like seeing someone else in distress. Seeing someone else looking fearful or sad is highly aversive to us, and this is why we get the skin conductance response. And it's thought that this is an adaptive response because it will stop us from being bullying or aggressive to someone when they are in distress. Now, if you don't receive those signals in a typical way, it's almost like the brakes are partly off for you in terms of committing those actions. In contrast to, I'm racing ahead of myself. So I'm also going to mention about some newer work that we've been doing with regard to positive emotions. So we got interested in thinking about why these children are not interested in affiliating with other people. Why don't they seem driven to please others or do things for others or act pro-socially towards others? So we thought maybe some of the positive emotion signals that are generally very rewarding and pleasing for us and promote us sort of joining in with others are also not processed typically in these children. And again, work by Sarah showed that these children are not distracted by happy faces. So this was a new finding. Normally studies that looked at recognition of happiness, these kids looked absolutely fine because happy faces are very easy to recognize. But if you give a more sensitive task, like an attentional capture task, which looks at more automatic processing of happiness rather than whether you can recognize it or not, these children again look different. And work led by my postdoc Liz O'Nyans and also Cesar Lima from Sophie Scott's lab has shown that these children also report diminished desire to join in with other people's laughter. So if you play them sounds of genuine laughter, which are typically very contagious, when we hear genuine laughter, we want to laugh along. Typically developing children indeed report that that's what they want to do, as do other children with conduct problems, but not those with high callous and emotional traits. So again, this is a much smaller line of work at the present, but it seems that signals that promote pro-social engagement may also be muted in these children. Those with low callous and emotional traits show a different profile. So they show typical attentional capture by emotional stimuli, both positive and negative, and in fact, in some cases, attentional bias to negative stimuli. So they are more likely to perceive neutral faces as aggressive, for instance. They also show emotional arousal to other people's distress. So depending on the task probe that you give, they either look like they are typical or they are different from typically developing children, but to the opposite direction to those with high callous and emotional traits. Now, it would be very odd if nothing is seen at the level of the brain given the differences that we see in behavior. So just like Paul said in his talk earlier today, there is nothing sort of special about seeing the brain light up. It doesn't really tell us a huge amount more than a really well-conducted behavioral experiment, although it's a bit exciting to see the colored flop on the brain. But basically, our work and others' work has shown that children with conduct problems overall, whether they are high or low in callous and emotional traits, show aberrant functioning of the brain's reinforcement circuitry, such as the orbitofrontal cortex and striatum. So essentially, the machinery for computing those prediction errors and expected values is not functioning optimally. And I think this helps explain why the children with conduct problems make poor choices and are not good at anticipating the consequences of their actions. But we also see some differences between the neural correlates between the two groups, and again, I don't think anybody should find this surprising. So we've looked at this using several different task probes, and I'm going to show you data from a few different studies. And here I'm going to give a little bit more detail of one of the tasks that we've used. So we used a so-called masked fear task. This was work done together with Amy McCrory, who leads the group with me, and also Kat Sebastian, who was working in our lab at the time. And we presented the children with either fearful or calm faces for 17 milliseconds, and then replaced those faces by a calm face of a different identity for 183 milliseconds. And this was a paradigm that Paul Whalen's group had developed. And when you do this, you don't actually consciously perceive the first face. We did a manipulation check at the end to make sure that these children weren't sort of consciously perceiving, seeing this first face. And they passively view the faces, and then you contrast the condition with the fearful masked face and the calm masked face with each other. And the nice thing about presenting it for a very short duration, after you've had a fixation cross to guide the eye gaze, is that the duration is shorter than an eye blink. So you can be relatively confident that the children are, for the most part, receiving the same visual stimuli, which is, you can be less confident of if you show a face for a long period of time, where some children might be looking at the mouth region, others the face region, and so forth. And what we showed was that there was a significant group difference in the reactivity of the right amygdala to the fearful versus calm faces. And the children with conduct problems and low CU traits showed the highest reactivity in this region. The typicals were somewhere in the middle, and those with the high callous and emotional traits showed the lowest amygdala reactivity. We matched the groups for IQ, socioeconomic status, for handedness, and these were all boys because conduct problems are more common in boys. The findings also weren't explained by any other symptoms that both of the conduct groups were high on. And we can also plot this within the group with conduct children continuously. So if you look at the callous and emotional traits increasing and amygdala reactivity, you can see that as the callous and emotional traits increase, the amygdala reactivity to the fear versus calm faces goes down. We've also looked at responses to pain stimuli in children with conduct problems as a function of callous and emotional traits. We presented children pictures of hands and feet in painful situations, and also with some other implements in non-painful kind of scenarios. And again, reactivity to the painful, seeing the painful stimuli versus non-painful stimuli was reduced in the anterior insula depending on your level of callous and emotional children in the conduct kids. And the conduct children overall showed lower reactivity than the typically developing children. And this was work led by Patricia Lockwood, who was doing a PhD in our group at the time. So there seems to be this heterogeneity in the neural response to negative emotions in children with conduct problems, which is found using multiple paradigms, not just the few that I showed you, and not just by our group. So other people have found that as well, including James Blair's group in the States. So we see it using masked fearful faces, using complex emotional scenes, doing studies that look at attention to negative emotion, and also studies that look at pain processing. What about neural reactivity to positive emotions? So this is the area that I'm interested in increasingly at the moment. And to date, there is only one study. So this is a study that we did in our group, and hopefully other people will replicate using different kinds of positive stimuli. So laughter is a very evolutionarily conserved emotional response. Even animals engage in it. It's something that promotes group cohesion. And you're 30 times more likely to laugh when you're in a company of other people than when you're on your own. And it, I think, signals that you're feeling relaxed, you're feeling nice, you're feeling positive, and you are also sharing with somebody else something that is very rewarding. And here's a very old photograph of my daughter, who's now 13 with Louis Arsenault having a very nice kind of interaction, which I think nicely illustrate that laughter really promotes you feeling joined up and affiliated with other people. It engages a large network of brain areas, but some of the very important ones that keep continuously coming up are supplementary motor area and anterior insula, which are thought to reflect the sort of the affective response to laughter and also the motor preparation to join in with other people. And when we compared boys who were typically developing, those who had conduct problems and high CU, and those who had conduct problems and low CU, and all matched for SES, IQ, handedness, and ethnicity, on their listening to genuine laughter, we saw group differences between the typical and the high CU groups in supplementary motor area and also in the anterior insula. We also saw group differences between the low CU group and typicals in the supplementary motor area, but not in the anterior insula. And as you recall, those with conduct problems and high CU report that they don't feel like joining in with laughter as much as the typically developing children do, and we measured this behaviorally outside the scanner. And what was interesting is that the anterior insular activity differences partly explained the differences in the self-reported desire to join in with laughter. So this reduced affective response to laughter, perhaps unsurprisingly, accounted for these children's self-reported diminished desire to join in with others. Now, of course, we don't know whether these brain findings are actually a consequence or a cause of atypical attention. So we are looking at cross-sectional data in early adolescence in these children, and they have had a whole host of developmental interactions with their caregivers and with their peers up to the point that we see them. And I think what will be really interesting in the coming years is to try and conduct studies with very, very young children, even from infancy onwards, to try and understand how dyadic reciprocal interactions develop between children who may be at risk and their caregivers. And my educated guess is that you will see some temperamental differences in the infants from early on. Those temperamental differences will probably be partly shared with the caregivers who may be thus more poorly equipped to socially interact with their children. But also a child who reacts differently will evoke a different reaction in a caregiver. And I'll return to this theme at the end of the talk, but I think it's a really interesting thing to think about how individuals shape their environments and also react to the environmental inputs that they receive, and that's something that sadly we know way too little about to date. So this brings me to origins of conduct problems in these two different groups. Are there different etiological factors at play? And one of the ways in which you can investigate this is by conducting twin studies if you have large enough sample that you can focus on the extreme. And this is something that we did in 2005 using the twins' early development data, which is a study led by Robert Bloom in King's. And we were able to focus on the children who were in clinical range for conduct problems and then divide them to those with high and low callous and emotional traits, and then compare identical and non-identical twins within each grouping to look at the relative importance of genetic and environmental factors. And what we found was that for those with high levels of callous and emotional traits, the difference in their level of conduct problems and the rest of the twin population was to a large extent explained by genetic differences and also to a smaller extent by child-specific environmental factors. And for the group with lower levels of callous and emotional traits, we saw a predominant importance of environmental influences, both child-specific and those that made family members more similar to each other. Now, it doesn't mean that this group is somehow genetically destined to become antisocial, or that this group doesn't have any genetic vulnerability at all. But the relative importance of genetic and environmental factors in predisposing to antisocial behavior seems to vary between these two groups. Now, obviously, the twin studies don't give us the identity of the genes or the identity of the environmental factors. It tells us about relative importance of those factors in explaining group differences or individual differences. So they don't have any bearing on a single individual, nor do they sort of identify specific genetic or environmental factors. So clearly, it's of interest to speculate what might be the genetic or environmental factors that are important. And theoretically, you can propose that any genetic variants that account for differences in emotional reactivity ought to be important here, or any genetic variants that account for differences in your propensity to affiliate with others ought to be important. However, to date, we have just made woefully little progress in identifying genetic variants associated with antisocial behavior even more broadly, let alone in the two subtypes. So we don't have currently reliable replicated molecular genetic findings. There are some studies that implicate serotonin system genes in both impulsive antisocial behavior and in more callous antisocial behavior. We know that this is linked to these variants are linked to emotional reactivity. Oxytocin system genes have been implicated in relation to CU traits, but the samples have been really, really small. They haven't been properly replicated. And we don't really have good genome-wide association studies to date. And if we look at data from areas where there has been a lot more molecular genetic work with big consortia such as IQ or educational attainment, if you look at the sample size, so this is add 3 zeros to each of these. So as the sample size goes up, the ability to pick up genes goes up exponentially. So it wasn't until the sample size hit million that we started to account for really sort of substantial proportion of variance in educational attainment. Even, in samples that are sort of 100,000, 150,000, people were only accounting for about 1 or 2% of the variance in educational attainment, which we know to be quite highly heritable, about 50% heritable. We've today only done like one slightly larger scale study of genome-wide association study of just broad antisocial behavior, not even grouping to subgroups. And this was led by Jorim Thielberg in Holland. And we had 25,000 people in the sample. We had an independent sample where we could test the genes that were harvested from the genome-wide analyses. And the polygenic risk score that we got from the genome-wide association analysis only accounted for 2% of the variance in antisocial behavior in the independent sample. And we did not account for any subtyping or developmental states. So it's going to be complicated. Around the same time, or a bit before that we did this, I was working with my then postdoc fellow, Jean-Baptiste Pingol, and we looked at development of conduct problems in the twin sample. And what was very interesting is that both the initial level of conduct problems and the developmental trajectory were heritable, so you can estimate heritability for the intercept and for the slope. However, the genetic overlap between the two was very modest. And this has another sort of very interesting implication, both for further genetic research, but also when we think about intervention. So the implication for genetic research is that you might be looking for different variants when you're interested in initial risk for antisocial behavior versus the maintenance of that risk. The implication for interventions might be that if you are encountering individuals who've been incredibly unfortunate to both have risk genes for initial behavioral problems and also for maintenance of those behavioral problems, you may need to think of not just early intervention, but early intervention and then multiple inoculations on the way in order to help these individuals function in a mainstream society. So we should expect to find cumulative polygenic effects, so we need larger samples and better phenotyping to find those. Perhaps rare variants are going to be important, and certainly some studies suggest that this should be the case, and this has also been a fruitful area of inquiry in autism and in schizophrenia. Gene-environment interplay is going to make it more complicated also to find the genetic variants, as are the developmentally varied effects. What about environments? So anyone who's ever read epidemiological study of antisocial behavior would suggest that, okay, harsh and inconsistent discipline should be something that is associated with antisocial behavior, as should be warm and consistent parenting in terms of being preventative against onset of antisocial behavior or maintenance of antisocial behavior. But can we really demonstrate, how well can we demonstrate environmental causality? So both children and their caregivers show substantial heritable individual differences in their social information processing, in their reasoning, in their affect regulation. And the environmental risk that we see in the families is not random. It's not something that randomly happens to the individuals. The genetic vulnerabilities that are present in the families also color the environmental, the social interactions that happen in those families. And I'm going to illustrate this by illustrating you phenomenon of evocative gene-environment correlation, which essentially is referring to different children who have different behavioral repertoires, evoking remarkably different reactions in the same adults. And I'm going to illustrate it with my own children. So here's my daughter, who's now 13, so this is some years back. She is the poster child for easy temperament. If I had stopped at one, I would be very smug and offering everybody lots of parenting advice. And then 3 years later, I had my son, who I like to think keeps me humble in terms of how readily I offer advice to other people. So here was a child you could always distract, you could always offer her something else to do. She was predominantly in a good mood. If she got a little bit dysregulated, you gave her hugs, she was absolutely fine. And not so with the second one, who could go on for 20 minutes like this if he wasn't allowed his favorite television program, or spend 2 hours screaming he's starving when you said he can't have a snack after he's had his evening snack, as in a delay tactics for going to bed. And 2 hours is impressive, but it's wearing. So no matter what your sort of ideas of parenting strategies are, you will end up applying them very differently if you have children with different temperaments. And you end up having very different social interactions with those children. So the children very actively shape their own social environments. And I think that these genetic and neurocognitive vulnerabilities that some people have restrict the range of possible social inputs over development, because if you are constantly difficult, you are less likely to get positive feedback, you're less likely to fit into a variety of situations. And the shared vulnerabilities may also undermine the caregiver's capacity to respond to the needs of the child. So someone with dysregulated temperament is also more likely to have a parent with a dysregulated temperament. And dealing with a child with dysregulated temperament is very challenging, and it's particularly challenging if you have difficulties regulating your own temperament. And there are also patterns that relate to your affective sort of ability to empathize with others and consider others' needs. So very recently, my student, Ruth Roberts, was doing some research on how parents of children with conduct problems experienced living with these children, what was the family functioning in those families. And she looked at children who had conduct problems and high callous and emotional traits, so the ones that are at risk of developing psychopathy, those who had conduct problems with lower levels of callous and emotional traits, and also typically developing children. And she found that families that have children who are at risk of developing psychopathy report atypical atypical emotional involvement within the family. So that was a part of the family functioning that was different in these families. So the family members using a sort of a standardized quantitative measure reported that they only show interest in each other when they want something. They're very focused on their own needs. And there were clear differences between the high callous children compared to typically developing children, but also compared to those children who had low callous and emotional traits. And Ruth did some very nice qualitative interviews with the families as well, which showed very similar findings. And twin and adoption research, which is the one that deals with the genetic confounding, has very clearly demonstrated that gene-environment correlation partly explains risk of developing antisocial behavior. So some of these environmental factors are in fact reflecting genetic vulnerabilities within the families. But interestingly, adoption data has also demonstrated environmental causality, both in relation to development of antisocial behavior more generally, but also in relation to callous and emotional traits. So there is genetic risk, but the genetic risk is not leading to an inevitable outcome. So a child with a genetic risk who has been parented by adoptive parents who are particularly warm and consistent has a better outcome than a child who has a genetic risk and whose adoptive parents are less able to be warm or consistent. Obviously, it's not just all about genes and gene-environment correlation. Early adversity clearly has an environmental impact that goes beyond just your genetic vulnerability. It has an environmental main effect. And this can calibrate your neurodevelopment in a way that the child ends up showing very different brain function, very different cognitive processes, because they spent their early childhood in an environment with very atypical inputs. So this sort of adaptation to the adverse environment is something that Eamon McCrory and I have called as engendering latent vulnerability. So these children understandably adapt to the environments that they are living in, and they end up calibrating their psychological processes in a way that suits that environment and might make them more safe in that environment, but may actually not be so conducive for living in a mainstream society and may longer term engender psychiatric vulnerability. And multiple systems we've shown can be calibrated by maltreatment, such as the detection of threat. This is a paper we published, I think 2011, so nearly 9 years ago now, where we looked at children who had been exposed to family violence growing up, and these were recruited via social services, so we had independently documented records of family violence. And compared to typically developing children who were matched for ability and SCS and age, these children showed heightened neural reactivity in the amygdala to threatening faces. And again, not really surprising. If you grow up in an environment where seeing this sort of a face means that you might not be safe, you will probably learn to pay attention to it, and you will probably react to it in a different way than a typically developing child. We've also shown that these children show different reinforcement learning. They show different autobiographical memory profiles, both behaviorally and also at the neural level, so their autobiographical memories are more impoverished. They have higher amygdala reactivity to negative autobiographical memories and lower hippocampal reactivity to positive ones. And we think that these sorts of latent vulnerability processes may not be immediately accompanied by symptoms of a disorder, but they may make the child more vulnerable to future stresses. And it may happen in multiple different ways. So the child who is always in a state of stress reactivity may actually cause wear and tear to their system by basically being in a state of heightened alert, which is essentially being chronically stressed out all the time. They may also react to other people in ways that over time leads to social thinning. They don't receive so much social support because they are constantly reacting to someone else as if they are being hostile. It's very hard to like someone who constantly treats you as if you're trying to threaten them. So the very children who possibly need the help the most may behave in ways that engenders that help the least. So in a way, I guess the point I'm trying to hammer home rather long-windedly is that the brain is not just the receiver of the environments, but also, when we take a developmental view, also a creator of the environments. And that genetic and environmental factors calibrate how the brain processes information and have an impact on socialization and on social interactions. I'm going to consider how this may look like for those with high callous and emotional traits and those with low callous and emotional traits. So if you think about some of the really key building blocks of successful socialization that parents and teachers utilize, we rely on the child's capacity for empathy. So we do a lot of empathy induction with smaller and older children. We ask them to imagine themselves in someone else's shoes, how they might be feeling if they were in the same situations. We help them make a connection between the action that they made and the outcome, which is somebody else's distress. And because typically they find that distress aversive, they try to avoid actions that cause it in the future. We use sanctions. So you take away some privileges when somebody's done something, or you remove them from the company of others if they behave in a slightly outrageous manner. And normally children make a connection between what they've done, the outcome, and they try and avoid the sanctions. And we often rely on their desire to please, their desire to be part of the group, desire to be affiliated with other people. So who wants to be in Team Tidy? Oh, you laid the table. Mummy is so pleased that you laid the table. That was really helpful. And most children find this very, very rewarding. They want to make you happy. They want to make you some rather awful Mother's Day cards because they think it's going to make you happy. And always you play along and say, this is delightful. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And that's very rewarding for most children. But for children with high callous and emotional traits, there is a muted dial on all of these areas, which makes the normal toolbox of socialization harder to apply for these children. For those with low callous and emotional traits, we know that they have excessive arousal to perceived threat, either in part because of their genetic endowment or because of the environmental experiences they've had as they've grown up. They also have poor ability to compute consequences of their behavior. So they may see a face that most of us would interpret as a perfectly neutral and benign, but they might interpret it as someone else challenging them. And they don't stop and think that attacking that person is likely to alienate people and mean that they find it hard to maintain friendships. They engage in threat reactive aggression. Over time, that leads to reduced social support, what I call social thinning. And then that obviously feeds into this picture of the world as a hostile place. And I would want to finish by saying that I think that if we want to make progress in mitigating development of psychopathology, we need to understand individuals as active creators of their own social environments. And we need genetically sensitive studies of environmental risk. And we also need to combine neurocognitive probes and sensitive measurement of social environment. And too often all of these bits of research have occurred in silos. And even though I'm bringing together some data from different approaches, none of these studies has really competently combined methods from the different areas in a single study in a longitudinal framework. And I think such approaches can help us to refine intervention approaches. So we can think about what are the best targets for intervention. So for instance, if somebody really doesn't have a natural arousal response to someone else's distress, do we want to spend our time trying to get them to empathize with others? And how reliably do we think we can engender that empathic response, for instance? I mean, it's an empirical question, but so far, the few studies that have tried it haven't shown hugely promising results. And I'm not very surprised. So if we think about individuals with anxiety disorder, which are sort of at the other end of the affective reactivity spectrum, these individuals feel very unpleasant a lot of the time. So there's a strong intrinsic motivation to try and engage in effortful strategies or attentional redeployment in order to reduce the anxiety-provoking experience. The guys with higher callous and emotional traits are not feeling bad. It's just the people around them that end up feeling bad. So I don't know what the intrinsic motivation for these people would be to try and engage in empathic processing. I would wager that majority of this audience doesn't have to think about empathizing with other people. If a loved one or a friend looks distressed, you automatically feel bad for them. It's not like you think, I'm going to crank up this empathic response now. And often the empathic response is actually very unpleasant because feeling someone else's distress is very negative. And in order to show compassion, we often have to engage in emotional regulation ourselves because we are in this feeling state that is unpleasant. So I'm somewhat skeptical as to how effective something like empathy induction might be for those with high callous and emotional traits because of their natural emotional reactivity. And we might find it more fruitful for instance, to try and make it more explicit to them how they can pro-socially look after number one. Now that is an effortful strategy that they will be interested in engaging in. We might also want to think about what we can use to motivate good behavior. So what are things that are natural reinforcers for these children and how we might be able to capitalize them? And they vary for different children with conduct disorders. They won't all be the same. And I think that has been a problem with a lot of the behavior modification programs, is that they've had a very standard set of reinforcers. But for a number of children, they don't find these things interesting. So it's not a behavior modification program for them anymore because you're not actually hitting their buttons. I think this sort of work can help us think about how to best support parents and teachers who are tasked with socializing a very challenging child. And in a clinical context, there may also be a challenge of the parents' own difficulties in some of the areas that the children find difficult, and thinking of how to sensitively work with those challenges. And I think we need to give some thought also into how often we need to deliver interventions. Should we expect that there is one magic bullet early intervention, if only we got that right, everything would be fine? Or would it be more realistic to think that there are some individuals who are very vulnerable and they need help early on, but they also need checking in at multiple time points? And the challenge, I think, over the next 50 years, 100 years, will be to really think about good ways to combining measurement in different levels of analysis, use it in developmental framework to provide a more nuanced understanding of individuals as active participants in their own environments. And I'm going to finish here. I'm going to finish by thanking all of our participants. Amy McCrory, who heads the unit with me, a number of people who worked with us at the unit. I want to acknowledge collaborators and funding, and I'm very happy to take questions if there's a little bit of time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Essi. Yes, I think we'll take a couple questions. Hard to resist. Okay, there's one right here at the front. Yeah.
Thanks very much for a really impressive talk and a fantastically impressive research and publication mass there is extraordinary. I'm going to break my own rule here and ask two related questions. One I think I've asked you before, and that is, there does seem to be an enormous overlap between callous unemotional traits and autism, but you haven't sort of mentioned that. And the challenging question, I feel really embarrassed to ask this of someone so eminent as yourself with such an impressive track record, but don't you think the terminology is rather derogatory? If you're saying that these traits are there from, some of them at least, are possibly genetically determined, they're from birth, shouldn't we be using less derogatory terms to describe these children?
Yeah. So I'll start with the last one, because I think that's a really, really important one. So I would want to say that they're not genetically determined, so there's genetic vulnerability. I think it's not a cookbook. It's a really hard question, because at the point that these traits are reliably picked up, the children are already clearly displaying behaviors that are callous and kind of uncaring compared to their same age peers. And interestingly, the parents and teachers who get in touch with me and who are really worried about these children often use language that I wouldn't use, which is that they often call these children psychopaths, which is what I would feel very uncomfortable with. But I think that at the moment, you know, it's a very it describes what it is. I think that the DSM felt very uncomfortable with it, so they use limited prosocial emotions to say exactly the same thing, and I think that may have been better from the start. It's language that everyone knows we're talking about the same things. To the extent that people have done any stigma research, people don't find that it's any more stigmatizing than saying conduct problems, for instance. I am sort of on the fence about it, because I think the labels in part matter depending on what you do with the labels. I would be very, very happy for us describing things more dimensionally, as long as we used the same terms consistently and there was really, really, really good agreement. At the moment, until we sort of achieve that, I think we're slightly stuck with using things that we at least all know that we're talking about the same thing. Otherwise, I think we have a danger of using very different criteria and actually then not advancing the research at all, because people are not talking about the same thing anymore. But I do absolutely take it on board. And partly, how you feel about the label also depends on whether people think that it designates that now you can't change, that that's who you are. And certainly the developmental data very clearly shows that people can change. They can increase in these sorts of traits, they can go down on these sorts of traits. But I appreciate that not everybody out there appreciates that sort of nuance, and it can feel harsh. So I think it's a really, really difficult issue, and it's an important one for us to think about. But if there is a change of nomenclature, then I would not want to go ahead with it until everyone was on board and agreed with it, so that we could then keep on studying the same thing really systematically. So possibly a cop-out answer, but that's, I think, the best I can give. With regard to autism, the other talk I prepared had some slides on it. So we got asked this question a lot, and I worked with Frankie Happy and Liz O'Nions, who did a PhD and postdoc with us. And we did a number of different studies, also with Alice Jones, who was a former PhD student. So Alice showed at the behavioral level that if you gave tasks that measured affective resonance and theory of mind, but where you had no emotional demands in the theory of mind tasks, and no theory of mind demands in the affective resonance tasks, you see this nice double dissociation, where those with high CU traits have difficulties with affective resonance, but not difficulties with mentalizing, and the other way around for the children on the autism spectrum. And this has been shown by other groups. We've also shown with imaging tasks that those with high callous and emotional traits engage the mentalizing network like the typically developing children. And we've shown with genetically sensitive multivariate genetic studies that there is almost no genetic overlap between the social domain of autism and the CU traits. So although both are highly heritable, the genes that impact the autism spectrum social side and those that impact CU traits are almost entirely non-overlapping. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't get some children who have the double hit. So there's a paper we published in 2006 that looked at this group of children and showed that they had difficulties both in affective resonance and in mentalizing. It also doesn't mean that individuals on the autism spectrum can't behave in a manner that might look callous and unempathic. And in part, I've got a good friend who's got high-functioning autism, and she says that she finds other people's distress so overwhelming emotionally she has to get away. Now, of course, that may socially look like you don't care and you're callous, but in her case, it's a self-preservation because it's too emotionally overwhelming. So I think that this is also just, to me, highlights the importance of trying to sensitively look at what underlies behavior. So if you're on the autism spectrum, you probably can't respond very sensitively or in a socially appropriate way to other people, but that doesn't mean that you don't necessarily feel what they're feeling.
Thanks for a brilliant talk. Just got a kind of a silly question, really, about the genetics, and also it might help with your own family situation. I mean, isn't there quite a large genetic component, and it's somewhere on the Y chromosome? Why doesn't that come out, or is it somehow you control for gender and then it's whatever's over and above that?
So you mean the MAOA gene or anything?
But generally, even in a GWAS, why aren't there big effects that can be attributed to maleness?
So I think the probably cop-out answer is that the causes of individual differences and mean differences might be different. So if you do quantitative genetic models, and you include the DZ opposite sex twins, which allow you to model whether there are qualitative sex differences, there aren't studies that find them, and there are now big meta-analyses. So it seems that the same genes are involved in accounting for individual differences in the male and the female distribution, but the male distribution is shifted, and we don't know why. And my educated guess is that some of it might have to do with hormones, some of it might have to do with sort of something to do with genetic effects that only affect men, or only affect you if you don't have the other X. And I think some of it has to do with culture. And interestingly, we've seen in recent years the mean difference between the boys and girls has narrowed, which suggests that some of it is actually has to do with cultural factors, and also would be in line with the fact that we don't find the qualitative sex differences. So if the risk is the same, and now the risk can express more readily in females because some of the differences are culturally are shifting, that would kind of make sense from that point of view.